The chest was not large. That was the thing she kept returning to in the cold November street, watching the broker's boy drag the shutters across the window while the last gray light dissolved into the London fog. Not large enough, one would think, to hold a woman's entire legal existence. And yet there it sat, somewhere behind that bolted door, behind the row of pawned crucifixes and silver plate and the decommissioned army swords that Mr. Pruitt kept as decorative stock, a plain cedar chest with a brass fitting and a lock of a pattern she knew by touch because she had been wearing the key on a ribbon at her wrist for the past 3 years, ever since her late husband had pressed it into her palm and told her quietly that the chest held what was hers. She had not known then that she would need to fight for what was hers. She had not known then that what she was is exactly what they intended to take. The season was the third of the Caverly dispute, as the legal clerks had taken to calling it, and Dorothea had learned to walk quickly through these streets, which were not the streets a duchess was meant to inhabit. She had learned to wear the dark cloak without the good lining, because the good lining was sold. She had learned to move through the broker's district with the expression of a woman on an errand, rather than the expression of a woman whose name was spoken daily in chancery with the qualifier "the woman who calls herself by it," as though 3 years of marriage and a proxy record witnessed by 7 people had been merely an affectation she had adopted, like a new hat. The boy finished with the shutters. Pruitt's was closed. She would try again in the morning. Dorothea, widow and disputed Duchess of Caverly, turned her collar against the November damp and walked back toward the respectable lodgings her cousin had arranged in Bloomsbury, where the fire was always small and the landlady always careful to address her as Mrs. Caverly, which was technically accurate and entirely wrong. She had been, once, the wife of Edmund, 7th Duke of Caverly, a quiet man of 52 who had married her privately before his health failed and had died 9 months later without updating his estate papers in the formal manner that Reginald, his younger brother, had subsequently argued the law required. The marriage was real. The proxy record was real. The letters patent that confirmed her dower right were real, and they were in the cedar chest, which was in Pruitt's shop, which was shut. And Reginald had put them there. He had done it through a corrupt footman, bribed in the week of Edmund's death when grief and propriety had kept Dorothea from the study, and the chest had passed out of the house with a consignment of miscellaneous estate effects, recorded in a false inventory as household surplus from the Caverly London property. By the time Alderton had tracked it to Pruitt's, Forshaw had already been retained, and Pruitt had already been given instructions, and the chest sat in the broker's back storage under a false lot name that bore no trace of its true contents. The season pressed on, indifferent. The ton discussed the matter in drawing rooms and over port with the particular relish they reserved for disputes that involved both property and female dignity, which was to say the specific category of dispute where the woman could be most easily doubted. She did not yet know, that November evening, that the man who would open the chest was already in the same city, already reviewing the same chancery file, and that he had been watching her since the previous Tuesday, when he had passed her in Chancery Lane and noticed her pressing 2 shillings into the hand of a street child and asking, in a voice entirely steady, which direction the broker's lane ran. If you have found your way to this story, you already understand something of what it costs a woman to ask directions to a pawnbroker's, aloud, in the street, in the year of our Lord 1814. Stay a little longer. She will not ask for long. The Chancery hearing had been a kind of theater. Dorothea had attended the first 2 in the belief that her presence would matter, that someone in the paneled room would look at her directly and recognize the absurdity of the proceeding, a woman whose marriage lines were witnessed sitting in an anteroom while men debated whether she existed in a legal sense. By the third hearing, she attended as a matter of record because her solicitor, a mild man named Alderton, who had represented her late husband's estate for 20 years and was frankly frightened of what the dispute had become, told her the committee expected her presence. The committee had 7 members. 5 she recognized as attached to Reginald's faction through the various cordial mechanisms of aristocratic loyalty. 1 was old and largely absent from the substance of the proceedings, his attention given over to a persistent cough. The 7th was the Earl of Stanwix, who sat at the end of the table nearest the window and said very little, and who had not, to Dorothea's knowledge, declared for either party. She had looked at him once, at the second hearing, in the moment when Reginald's solicitor had produced a written argument that referred to her, in formal legal prose, as the woman who purports to hold the title. She had looked at him because she was looking for any face in the room that registered the weight of that sentence, and his had registered something. A faint contraction behind the eyes, quickly controlled, the kind of small expression that precedes a word, and then thinks better of it. She had not permitted herself to trust it. She had not permitted herself to trust much, lately. The Earl of Stanwix was 35 years old, and had been a widower for 4 years, which the Ton had considered unfortunate, but not defining until the inquiry that followed the death, which had been, by all accounts available to Dorothea through Alderton's cautious briefings, a thing of genuine cruelty. His first wife's proxy record had been challenged after her death, the legitimacy of their son called into question, and the resulting proceeding had stripped the boy's right to inherit through the Countess's line. The Earl had not spoken publicly about any of it. He sat now on the Chancery Committee, a man of precise legal intelligence, and the Ton said he was there because Reginald's family had supported his appointment and could expect his votes in kind. Dorothea had not trusted the Ton's reading in some time, but she had not yet found reason to replace it. The 4th hearing was on a Thursday, and it was at the 4th hearing that the dismissive label moved from private parlors into official record. Reginald's principal solicitor, Forshaw, who was very good at what he did, introduced an argument for summary dismissal of Dorothea's representation on the grounds that her claim rested on a proxy record that had not been filed in the required manner, and that, consequently, the woman who calls herself Duchess of Caverley had no more standing in this proceeding than any interested party from the public. He said it 3 words at a time, measured and polished, and the room's quality of attention shifted with each word in the way rooms do when they sense which direction confidence is moving. She did not look at the man at the end of the table. She looked at her own gloved hands, which were perfectly still in her lap, because she had spent 3 years learning to perform stillness in rooms designed to break her. She heard him, though. She heard the faint sound that was not quite a cleared throat, not quite a word, but that altered the quality of the air in the chamber, the way a window raised an inch alters the quality of a room. And when she looked up, Forshaw had stopped mid-sentence, and the Earl was writing something at his place, and the old peer with the cough had woken up. Nothing came of it immediately. She looked, and he was already looking elsewhere, and the session concluded without a ruling. She met him, properly, not in Chancery, but in the broker's district. It was the following Tuesday, cold and drizzling, the kind of November rain that does not commit to falling, but simply exists in the air as a general condition of the atmosphere, and Dorothea was in the lane behind Warwick Court, speaking to a child she had paid twice before for information about Pruitt's back entrance. The child was 9, perhaps 10, a sharp-faced girl named Nell, who moved through the district with the invisibility of someone entirely below the social machinery's notice, and who had for 4 shillings total told Dorothea more about the interior arrangement of the broker's shop than Alderton had managed with 3 separate inquiries through official channels. She was paying Nell for the 3rd piece of information, which concerned a side door that Pruitt used for larger consignments when she became aware that she was being observed. She had developed, over 3 years, a reliable sense of being watched, and it was not the paranoid variety, not the constant sharpening that comes from fear, but the simple occupational attentiveness of a woman who had learned that the difference between a thing going well and a thing going badly was often a matter of noticing who was in a room before the room noticed her. She felt the gaze on the back of her neck, and noted it, and did not, by any visible movement, acknowledge it. She did not turn immediately. She finished paying Nell. She said, in the same measured tone she used for all her conversations in this district, that she would return on Friday. And she pressed 2 shillings into the girl's hand, and Nell made them disappear with the practiced speed of a Covent Garden conjurer. And then Dorothea straightened and turned, and found a tall man in a dark navy coat 6 feet away in the lane, his hat lowered against the rain, watching her with the expression she had last seen at the Chancery hearing, the one she had refused to trust. The rain had darkened his shoulders and gathered in drops along the brim of his hat. He had clearly been standing there for some minutes, long enough to have seen the full transaction, the shillings, the conversation, the methodical exchange of information in the back lane of a district where a woman of any station had no ordinary business. He did not look embarrassed by having been caught watching, which was itself a kind of information. He looked as though he had been waiting to be seen. "You are very methodical," he said, his voice level and unhurried, as though they were encountering each other at a drawing room rather than a back lane in the rain. "I have had to be," she said. He looked at the child's retreating back, and then at Dorothea's face. And she waited for something condescending, something procedural, something that placed her on the correct side of the committee's neutrality. He said none of those things. "Do not go to Pruitt directly," he said, his tone not unkind. "He has instructions." "Whose?" she said. "Forshaw's client." She understood then that this was the first sentence of a different kind of conversation, and she understood it fully enough not to ask any more questions in a wet lane. She said she was expected at her solicitor's. He said he hoped the solicitor was not Alderton, and when she confirmed that he was, he said only, "Come to Gray's Inn tomorrow, not Chancery." Gray's Inn, and named an hour, and turned up his collar and walked back in the direction he had come from. And she stood in the lane after he was gone, the rain settling into her shoulders, and did not permit herself to think anything too quickly. She would learn his wound gradually, the way one learns the true shape of a house by living in it, rather than standing outside reading the facade. She knew, by the time of their 3rd meeting at Gray's Inn, that he was reading the Caverly file not as a committee member, but as a man who had spent 4 years turning a particular kind of legal cruelty over in his hands and understanding every face of it. He spoke about proxy records with the precision of someone who had, himself, watched a proxy record destroyed, and when he referred to his first wife, it was briefly, once, in the middle of an explanation about the specific attestation requirements under the relevant statute, and he said only, his eyes on the file, that her papers were not missing. They were replaced. "Replaced," Dorothea said. "Someone filed a corrected document. The correction made her marriage a fiction after the fact." He did not look up from the page. "I did not understand, at the time, that a document could be a weapon." She looked at him. She looked at the particular stillness he maintained when he was absorbing something he had decided not to show. And she understood, with the precision that a year of surviving on close reading had given her, that he was not speaking abstractly. "Your son," she said. "He is 8 years old and knows none of it." The words were level. The hand holding the page was not. She did not say anything comforting, because he had not asked for comfort, and because comfort was not what was wanted. "Then you understand what is in the chest," she said. "I understand exactly what is in the chest," he said, his voice quiet and certain. She had worn the key on its ribbon since her wedding day, out of sentiment, because Edmund had pressed it into her palm and said something gentle, and she had kept it the way she kept all his gentle things, carefully, in the absence of much else to hold. She had not known it would become the instrument of a legal proceeding. She touched it now, through her glove, and Marcus watched the small gesture without comment, and she thought, not for the first time, that his silence communicated more precisely than most men's sentences. At their second meeting, he had asked what she did in the evenings, which was such an unexpected question that she had answered honestly. Which was to say, she went over Alderton's notes and looked for the places where the case had weaknesses, and tried to address them before Forshaw found them first. He had been quiet for a moment, and then said, without any inflection she could read, that Alderton's notes were comprehensive, but that Forshaw had already identified the same weaknesses and was planning to introduce them at the 5th hearing. She had asked how he knew, and he had not answered directly, but he had set a marked page in front of her from a prior chancery proceeding and suggested she read the section on procedural standing, and when she had read it, she understood that he had, without announcing his intention, been working the same problem from inside the proceeding, while she had been working it from outside. She did not thank him effusively. She did not quite know yet whether she was permitted to trust it. She said it was useful, and he said he supposed it might be, and they parted with sufficient formality to satisfy anyone who might have been observing, and insufficient distance from the inside. There was a moment, at the edge of the second meeting, when he had reached across the table to retrieve a document, and his hand had passed close to hers, not touching, the warmth of it simply present in the air between them for a half-second, before he withdrew. And she had felt the pulse at her wrist sharpen in the way that had nothing to do with the documents. She had noted it in the same manner she noted all inconvenient truths, precisely and without giving them room to determine anything. She was not yet prepared to determine. She had looked back at the page in front of her. Her face had not changed. What she was less certain about was whether his had changed. She had not looked. She looked at the third meeting. She looked in the way that is not looking, the peripheral attention she had developed from 3 years of being in rooms where she was not supposed to see certain things, and she observed that when she reached past him for the inkwell, his jaw tightened, faintly, and his eyes held still on the page in the deliberate manner of a man keeping them there. She observed this, and filed it in the same careful place she filed everything she was not yet permitted to act on. The key. She had worn it so long she had ceased to feel its weight, and yet her hand kept returning to it in the evenings when the lodging was quiet, and the fire was almost out, and the stack of legal documents on the small table was exactly as impractical and exactly as real as it had always been. Edmund had given it to her at their wedding, in a private moment before the ceremony, pressing it into her palm in the way he gave most things, quietly and without ceremony, and saying that the chest would hold what was hers, and she should keep the key safe. She had taken it as sentiment. She had taken most of what Edmund said as sentiment, which was not wrong exactly, but which had missed the second layer. And she had spent 3 years slowly discovering what that second layer contained. The dismissive label found her again at a rout at Lady Colthurst's, which was where the season gathered in November when it could not quite decide whether to disperse. Dorothea had attended as her cousin's companion, which was the most comfortable fiction available, and she had been standing near the window with a glass of wine she had not yet touched when she heard, from the direction of two women whose backs were to her, the sentence said with a particular mixture of pity and finality. Poor creature, still presenting herself in public. The woman who calls herself Duchess, as though the court had not as good as decided already. She set the glass on the nearest surface and looked out the window at the dark street below, and did not let herself feel the sentence until she was home, and the fire was low enough that no one would see her face. What she did not know that evening was that Forshaw, the following Monday, would appear at Marcus's chambers at Gray's Inn with a procedural instrument he called a certification, a formal statement that the committee's senior member had been presented with attestation supporting Reginald's prior claim to the estate management. It was filed correctly. It bore the Earl's name. Alderton sent her a copy by messenger that afternoon, with a note that said the solicitor feared they must revise their expectations. She read the certification once. She read it twice. She put it on the table and looked at the key on her wrist and understood that she had made the error she had spent 3 years trying not to make. She had permitted herself to believe that one person's reading of her was accurate, and she had been wrong. She did not cry. She had done very little crying in 3 years, not from hardness of feeling, but from a kind of economy. The same economy that made her wear the coat without the good lining and take the lodgings with the small fire. The understanding that resources were finite and must be directed toward what they could actually do. Crying in her Bloomsbury room would not open the chest. It would not alter the certification. It would simply cost her something she could not afford to spend. She sat with the document until the fire went out, and then she wrote to her cousin and said she thought perhaps lodgings further from the Inns of Court would be sensible, as the Bloomsbury rooms had become expensive, and the matter was perhaps further from resolution than she had initially calculated. She folded the letter and sealed it and placed it on the table beside the certification, and sat in the cold. She did not send the letter. Not because she had hope, particularly, but because she had developed, over 3 years, a habit of waiting one night before deciding that a thing was lost. It had not always rewarded the waiting. She waited, regardless. That night she sat at the window and watched the street below, which was quiet in the particular way of London residential streets after midnight, the footsteps occasional and purposeful, the link boy's torch moving in and out of the fog at the far end. And she thought about the key and the chest and the man who had sat across from her at a scratch table in Gray's Inn and spoken about documents as weapons with the precision of someone who had been on the losing end of one. She thought about the way he had looked at the key on her wrist and said nothing, and about the way he had said nothing in the Chancery Chamber in a manner that had altered the quality of the air, and about the half-second of warmth, when his hand had passed close to hers, and she had looked back at the page, and not looked up. She thought about the certification, and what it might mean if she read it not as a verdict, but as an instrument designed to be read in 2 directions. And she sat with that thought until the street was fully dark and quiet, and the candle had burned low, and she could not decide whether what she was entertaining was perception or desperation. And she went to bed without deciding. The key was warm in the hollow of her wrist, where she had pressed it when she lay down. She was still wearing it. She had never, in 3 years, taken it off to sleep, and she did not take it off now. She was, at least, still in Bloomsbury in the morning. Marcus arrived at Chancery the following Thursday morning with a cedar chest. He had, it emerged, been in Pruitt's shop the previous afternoon with a court order, a procedural instrument, and a member of the committee as independent witness, and he had retrieved the chest from its position in Pruitt's back storage under its false lot name, which was listed in the broker's inventory as miscellaneous household effects from the Caverly consignment. He had carried it himself the last 2 streets, which was not, as the witness would later remark to anyone who asked, what committee members typically did. He arrived in the Chancery anteroom at the hearing hour. Reginald was present with Forshaw and 2 additional counsel. Lady Caverly was present with a rigid excellence of posture that she had maintained, in Dorothea's observation, in every formal setting for the past 3 years, as though she had understood from the start that the dispute was not a legal matter, but a social one, and that her primary task was to look as though the outcome had already been decided in the correct direction. 5 committee members were present. Alderton was present, looking simultaneously alarmed and cautiously hopeful, which was his professional range. Dorothea was present, because she was always present. The Earl set the chest on the committee table without speaking. The quality of silence this produced was the particular silence of a room that had been certain of its direction, and has just encountered an obstacle it had not planned for. Reginald found his voice first. "By what authority?" he said, his manner still carrying the confidence of a man who had not yet calculated the full implications of the cedar object in front of him. "Court order, signed yesterday," Marcus said. He looked at Forshaw rather than at Reginald, which was a more precise destination for the information. The broker was not difficult to persuade. The instructions he had received were verbal and from a secondary party, which made the order straightforward. Forshaw made an objection about procedural irregularity. Marcus answered it briefly. Forshaw made a second objection about the committee's authority to receive evidence of this nature. Marcus answered that one as well, citing the relevant provision with the tidiness of a man who had spent the previous week making certain he had the provision precisely right. Then he turned and looked at Dorothea across the room. "Miss Caverly," he said, using her maiden form because the chest was not yet opened. It was a precision she understood immediately. "Do you have the key?" Lady Caverly spoke from her chair, her voice very controlled. "This is absurd. The woman has no standing in this proceeding." He did not look at Lady Caverly. He did not shift his weight or adjust his expression. He said, into the room's held breath, "This chest belongs to the Duchess of Caverly. I attest it." 11 words. The room went absolutely still. He crossed to where Dorothea stood and stopped before her, his hand slightly extended, and she understood that what he was asking for was the key, and she understood that what he was doing with the key was not retrieving it, but inviting her to hand it to him, which was entirely different. Which was a choice she was being asked to make, rather than a document she was being asked to produce. She untied the ribbon. She placed the key in his hand. His fingers closed over it for a moment, and over hers with it. And that was the only physical contact between them, which was entirely proper, and which was not, from the inside of it, a small thing at all. He opened the chest. He lifted out the letters patent, the marriage proxy record witnessed by 7 names, the attestation of the marriage ceremony, the sealed confirmation from the Bishop of Caverly's diocese. He set each document on the committee table in order, and the room's silence altered in quality with each one, becoming less resistant and more something that resembled recognition, the reluctant and slowly warming kind, the kind a room produces when it understands it was wrong and is calculating how to absorb that fact with the minimum available loss of composure. Forshaw made 3 additional objections. Marcus answered each one briefly, from the relevant statute without raising his voice. Reginald looked, by the 3rd objection, like a man who had wagered on a card he had marked himself and found the marking insufficient. Lady Caverly, at the end of it, straightened very slightly in her chair, lifted her chin, and said in a voice that was nearly steady that she saw. It was the most honest thing Dorothea had ever heard her say. The committee did not rule that day. These things are never completed in a single afternoon, and Dorothea had learned not to require them to be. The documents were placed in formal custody. Alderton wept briefly in the corridor, which she forgave him, and then collected himself, and went to look at the proxy record with the expression of a man touching a relic. She stood in the corridor after the room had emptied and felt the particular quality of silence that follows something that has been decided, whether or not any formal authority has yet said so. The silence of a thing no longer in motion. Finally settling, she heard his step behind her. She did not turn immediately. "The certification Forshaw filed," he said. "I know," she said. "It required my name, because the instrument required a committee member. I was the only one who would sign something Forshaw did not expect to be used against him." He paused. He filed it in the belief that a committee member certifying the prior claim's attestation would close the proceeding. He was correct that certification from me would alter the proceeding. He was incorrect about the direction. She was quiet for a moment. She thought of the letter she had written and not sent, and the night at the window, and the quality of her own reasoning in the small hours of a cold morning when she could not decide what was perception and what was desperation. She turned around. He was standing at the distance that was correct, and that was, from the inside, not correct at all. And his face was wearing the expression she had first seen and refused to trust. And she was not going to refuse it again. She was done refusing things that were plainly in front of her. "You could have told me," she said. "Yes," he said, and he did not offer any excuse for it. "I wanted the room to hear what they said about you before they had to hear what I said about you." She looked at him. She understood this. She understood it in the way she understood everything precise and quietly motivated that he had done across the past month, the way she understood that a man who had watched a legal instrument strip his son's legitimacy would recognize, in his marrow, what it meant to sign a document that most people would read in one direction when he meant it to move in another. "The key was my husband's wedding gift," she said. "I know," he said. "I thought it was sentiment," she said. "It was both," he said, and his eyes held steady on hers. And neither of them moved, and the corridor was quiet around them in the way that specific spaces become quiet when something has been completed inside them. The formal ruling came 6 weeks later, in January, which was cold and clear in the particular brilliant way of the Caverley Dower House in winter, when the frost on the stone walls caught the morning light and held it for a moment, before releasing it into the ordinary gray of the day. She received the letter from Alderton at the breakfast table with her cousin, and she read it without expression, and then she placed it beside the marmalade jar and ate the rest of her toast before she said anything. Her cousin looked at her steadily. "He ruled in my favor," Dorothea said. Her cousin made a sound of considerable relief and pressed her hand. Dorothea looked at the fire and felt the hearing's held breath finally, completely, exhale. The Dower House was cold in the way of large old houses that have not been properly occupied, the fires not yet rebuilt to their correct levels, the rooms still carrying the particular chill of disuse. She did not mind it. She had lived in a room with a small fire for the better part of a year. She knew how to be cold. She walked through the rooms on the first morning and put her hand on the window frames and the table edges and the backs of chairs, not in any ceremonial fashion, but in the way a person handles what is theirs, matter-of-factly, confirming the fact of possession through the ordinary weight of things. The library had been undisturbed. The small sitting room off the east corridor still had the book she had left open on the window seat the morning of Edmund's funeral. Its pages faded at the edges now, the marker still in place. She stood at the threshold of that room for a moment with her hand on the doorframe, not entering, only looking. And then she went to find the housekeeper and discuss the state of the kitchen garden. The chest was in the drawing room. She had placed it there partly from sentiment, and partly because she was not ready to have it out of her sight, and the documents were in Alderton's custody under seal, where they would remain as a matter of record, which was the proper place for instruments that had been fought over and needed to be permanently beyond contest. The key she had kept. It sat on the mantelpiece above the fire, looped still on its faded ivory ribbon, and she had placed it there in the first days of January when the Dower House became fully, legally, unambiguously hers again, and she had looked at it and thought of Edmund's hands, the papery, dry warmth of them, and the thing he had said, and she had thought, quietly, that he had been right. It was both. Marcus arrived on a January afternoon when the light came through the drawing-room windows in long, level lines and made the room look like something carefully considered. He was shown in by the housekeeper, who had an expression of composed approval that Dorothea noted and did not comment on. He came in and stood by the door for a moment, looking at the room as he looked at things. With attention, and without rush. He looked at the key on the mantelpiece. "You kept it there," he said. "It belongs there," she said. He sat in the chair by the fire that she had been occupying the winter before in the rented lodging where the fire was always small, and he looked different in the Dower House light. Or perhaps she was different. Or perhaps the difference was the particular quality of a room that has been restored to the person it belongs to, which changes the weight of everything in it. "I had a letter from Alderton," he said. "So did I," she said. "He is very formal," he said. "He wept in the corridor," she said. "He is less formal than he appears." Marcus looked at her with the expression that was, she had determined, his version of amusement, the small contained thing that lived behind the eyes and very rarely reached the rest of his face. And it had the same quality it had always had, which was that it was a significant event. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the frost on the stone balustrade was catching the afternoon light and making it do particular things. She was aware of exactly where he was in the room, the way she had been aware of his position at every meeting they had had, without permitting herself to name the awareness. "My son's name is Thomas," he said at last, his voice level and careful. "He is 8 years old, and he reads at a level that his tutors find unsettling." He paused. "He has asked me twice now who we are going to visit in January." She looked at him. She looked at him the way she had first looked at him in the Chancery anteroom and refused to trust what she saw, and the way she had looked at him in the corridor after the chest was opened. And then she looked at him the way she was going to look at him for the rest of her life, which was directly, without apology, without suppressing what she saw. "Tell him he is welcome at Caverley in the spring," she said, "when the grounds are properly fit for an 8-year-old who reads at an unsettling level." "I will tell him," he said. He reached across the distance between the chairs, not touching, simply extending his hand to the space between them. And she looked at it, and then looked at his face. And the expression there was the one she had learned to read over the past months. The one he deployed when he was asking something he considered it important to ask correctly. And she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around it with the same deliberate exactness he brought to everything, and they sat in the Dower House drawing room in the January afternoon, and said nothing for a while, which was, between them, not a silence, but a language. She could feel the fire at her left side and the cold of the window at her right, and his hand warm over hers, and the room that was hers, and the key on the mantelpiece above the fire, and the whole long, patient length of the past 3 years behind her. And she thought, simply, that it was enough. More than enough. That it was the kind of enough that takes a long time to arrive, and then, having arrived, is unmistakably and permanently itself. He stayed until the afternoon light shifted to the particular late winter blue that preceded dusk, when the frost on the window glass began to spread in fine branching lines from the corners. The housekeeper came to stir the fire and withdrew with the same expression of composed approval. He said, when the fire was rebuilt and the room was properly warm, that he thought he had mentioned Thomas would be available from the middle of March onward, if the grounds were manageable by then. She said the grounds were generally manageable by the first week of March, in her experience, and that there was a walled garden to the south of the house that the previous Duke had maintained as a kitchen garden, but which might, she thought, be better suited to other purposes. He nodded once, which was, from him, a complete sentence. When he left, the room was warm and quiet, and entirely altered from what it had been a year ago, which was a way of saying that it had been restored to what it should always have been, and was beginning, now, to become something more than what it had been before the chest was lost, which was something she had not, until recently, believed she was permitted to want. The key stayed on the mantelpiece. The candle beside it was still burning when the housekeeper came in to draw the curtains, and she left it burning because there was no practical reason to extinguish it, and because some things deserve, at last, to give light without being put out. If this story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments about the small thing that held you. These stories are made for the evenings when you need to know that quiet worth is eventually seen by someone whose seeing changes everything. Thank you for remaining until the end.